Social Affairs, and we are so excited to have our guest speaker today. Just as a reminder, we are recording this session so that we can share it on our website and for you to be able to come back to it as you'd like. I do want to start off by saying we are now in Latinx Excellence Month. You may know it as Hispanic Heritage Month. We did an intentional shift in the language as to how we would refer to this particular month, and the ones that are coming up want to focus in on the excellence and achievements, celebrate all those folks who sometimes go unnoticed. And so we want to make sure to elevate those stories during these months, and any month really during the year. But with this, I am so excited to have our guest speaker because he is one of those folks on our campus who I see as portraying excellence. A graduate student who has been very involved with many events, programs, initiatives across campus. And he's with us today to really talk about sustainability in a way that is so important, specifically within the Latinx community. So the title for today's session is Sustainability, La Lucha del Pueblo, the Fight of the People, the 21st Century Dilemma Between Development and Degradation. I'm so excited to have you, Ronald, with us. I'll let you take over and introduce yourself and get us started with the topic. So welcome.
Everybody, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming to our virtual M Room. And as everyone knows, I'm a permanent resident in the M Room. And it's really an honor to be hosted here by the Office of Multicultural Affairs, an office that has really sustained me and my academic pursuits here at Lehigh, and I'm eternally grateful for all the support. So to start it off, I'd like to share just a really short clip, if I may. I'll show like little clips throughout the presentation, and hopefully it all makes sense. So here we go. Start from the beginning. So sustainability, la lucha del pueblo, the people's fight. A question between, currently we look at things like development and we like, oh, development, that sounds really good. But unfortunately, sometimes it comes with unintended consequences or intended consequences that come from malicious intent, like environmental degradation for short-term profits. We see that especially, so I'm originally born in Peru, but raised most of my life in the Great Lehigh Valley. But I returned to Peru to visit my family members on mother's side. And, back in Peru, and you see that like we have a tropical rainforest, we have something called the fauna, and these areas tend to get really negatively, adversely affected due to, just the economic incentives that come with degrading those regions. So I just kind of want to talk to you about when you hear the word underdeveloped, what comes to mind? Like when you hear like, significant peak regions in the world referred to as underdeveloped or third world, less developed. What do we think? Because these are regions that contribute, that are referred to like in terms of population, the majority of the world, and that's what's used to really define those regions. So what really comes to mind when we think of those terms, especially? We'd like to open up to the conversation to anyone who's thinking about what those specific words mean to you when you hear it from first glance.
I'll jump in. Here, let me get my camera back on. Somebody hit it in the chat, I think of poverty, right? I oftentimes think of theft of people who have been stolen from, their lands, who have been taken, reappropriated. Um, yeah, those are sort of the things I think of when folks talk about the underdeveloped.
In the chat, there's some folks mentioning lack of resources, lack of education, poor because of colonialism, unbalanced distribution of wealth. So those are some examples in the chat.
I also just wanted to say one thing too. I feel like, I mean, I know we have a lot of natural disasters in this country as well, but I feel like a lot of these countries are affected by like earthquakes, tsunamis. There's just a lot of natural disasters, and they just don't have like the resources to like rebuild their countries. So anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. I love this. One thing I really caught my eye one time was when someone twisted the dialogue from being underdeveloped countries to countries that are overexploited. Because sometimes it's not really necessarily a flaw within the people themselves. Rather, it's a flaw within the systems in which their livelihoods are, controlled by. So what, when we look at the trustee program the United Nations brought forward, and when countries were, colonialism was becoming less of a thing that, Western countries, imperialist countries wanted to really be a part of in the most direct sense of the word. And so what they would do is they would give independence, but if the independence movements didn't go the way they wanted to, then they would intervene in many cases. And then we go to things like the resource curse. In a lot of these regions that are considered undeveloped, there's the resource, like vast amounts of resources, which if they were used in a way to benefit the communities in which the region, the region's inhabitants, we would see a completely different story. So the resource curse, one of the prime examples that is used in a lot of literature is the example of what is currently the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which was ruled by King Leopold II, a very brutal colonial ruler of the region. And he even had the capital city named after himself. You can see how arrogant the guy kind of was. And not just that, but he really did not view his colonial subjects as human beings. He viewed them as a means to an end to, exploit them to death at a point where it can only be considered like enslavement and genocide and very brutal, inhumane conditions, and nothing positive. Like, but in his rhetoric, he would consider himself to be a great civilizer, a great liberator of human barbarism, as what he would consider himself to be. And one of the largest acts of genocide in human history occurred at the leadership of King Leopold II. And I think that's something very important to put into reference. Finally, when the Democratic Republic of the Congo was given their right to autonomy, you saw a leader named Patrice Lumumba that kind of came into the story trying to improve the human condition in his country. And as difficult as it was, because there was different linguistic groups, there was a lot of different identities that kind of conflicted within the region of the Congo. So he had a really serious task to play to try to unify the region and to be independent and sovereign. But what we saw was he said some things that did not, and he did some actions that were not really aligned with the status quo of many Western governments. And we even saw the Western governments kind of coordinate an operation that would corrupt a lot of military officials to go against Patrice Lumumba. And I wouldn't necessarily say this is an isolated incident. We see that many leaders, whether it's through the global South, get removed whenever they try to go towards a situation of whether it's protections for the environment. So Bolivia was one of the first countries that actually gave rights, like living rights to the environment, especially protecting regions of the Amazon that previously were open to exploitation and resource extraction. So one thing, as I mentioned, so my mother's side of the family is all from Peru. I was born in Peru. And what we saw is, the US free trade agreement had, an effect on the Peruvian economy and the Peruvian citizenry at large. So when we think of free trade agreements, what do we think? Are they good, bad? Is it complicated to say whether they're good or bad, or they're, mixed results? What do we think? Open to, I'm sure many of us studied economics. We know whether free trade agreements are good or bad, or what do we think?
I can jump in here. So I'll be honest, I initially thought it was good, because it's kind of portrayed, or the narrative is that it's something that's going to be helpful for the communities. But I'm leaning more towards complex, because it's helpful for the communities. Why? Who is benefiting, and why are they benefiting? And so that's something that I question when I see free trade. It just isn't as straightforward good as we are meant to believe.
Yeah, I think that's a good example that we can bring into, let's say, agriculture, right? So with a lot of the free trade agreements, I can speak more specifically with trade agreements that are done with the United States and Latin American countries. The United States, their agricultural sector is very industrialized, and at the same time, it is very subsidized by the US government, which is the part about being subsidized by the US government, especially if it supports small farmers. That's a great endeavor, and I fully support that endeavor. But when we're doing free trade agreements with other countries, those countries simply can't compete with the United States in the agricultural sector, when the agricultural sector is supported by subsidies, as well as the industrial infrastructure to mass produce agriculture. And we see this most example in southern Mexico, where there was a significant population of people, especially in Chiapas and other like Oaxaca, and especially major regions of southern Mexico, Zacatecas, that were literally displaced, like large populations of millions of people displaced off their lands because of the prohibition of communal agriculture, and as well as more indigenous forms of agricultural activity. And it was all majorly like privatized to multinational firms, their ancestral lands and things like this. So it was a huge displacement because of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so just in general, these countries have very difficulty because they're not allowed to either practice their indigenous forms of agriculture, they're not allowed to do communal agriculture because of the rules stipulated within the free trade agreements, as well as in many cases, those countries are also not allowed to have, their governments are not allowed to subsidize agricultural productivity in their countries through the free trade agreements. So the small agricultural worker is, disadvantaged on a double scale because of many of these free trade agreements in Latin America. That's why many of us have, I'm sure, heard of Central American countries or Caribbean countries being referred to as banana republics. And a big thing of that is because of what companies like the United Fruit Company, which is currently Chiquita International, had a role in, using these free trade agreements or using U.S. government influence to really monopolize agricultural productivity in those countries, and then make the working conditions in those countries very adverse to the workers that are working and tilling the land. A lot of this comes along with privatization measures outside the sector of agriculture, but sometimes affiliate alike. So like, look at water supply. Many people in Peru or in many other countries in what are considered the underdeveloped world have plenty of water supply naturally, natural endowments of good water that could be used for drinking, for other purposes, even for their own local agricultural operations. But because of privatization measures, for members of the working poor, it becomes very inaccessible to access those, water supply resources. And it has a very, sometimes also these policies, especially when it comes to, you privatize the rights to mining rights in certain areas. They don't necessarily have the environmental regulation needed to ensure that, the water supply won't get contaminated because of the mineral extraction. So you see that as well, having a very adverse environmental impact as well. So it is very complex. A lot of people say like, oh, you're stimulating the economy through these free trade agreements, but not everyone is necessarily benefited, like the aggregate citizenry. So if I may, I would like to share a little piece here with regards to exit. Okay, perfect. I would like to share a quick little video as to kind of like what got me involved with these kind of things. It's very graphic, so if just a warning, this kind of stuff is not pleasant stuff to see. But when I go home to Peru, this is kind of what I see. The city where my family lives is called Tuman, and it's been under military and national police force occupation because the sugarcane workers for a long time have been advocating for better working conditions, because they work sometimes 12-hour shifts, working in really horrific conditions, with sugarcane work, very exploitative, and they make about $3 a day working, those 12-hour shifts. And it's not really the situation where you can really support, relatives and family members under this situation. But there's anyone here what's going on?
I think you need to share screen and share sound.
On very small, hardworking sugarcane village, where a lot of the people are being protesting for better working conditions. And they don't have weapons of their own, but they're allowed to carry weapons. They plant rocks. And just to continue, we also see in the rainforests, this is kind of a documentary that I found to be very useful to really explain the situation going on in the Amazon rainforest. And this was adversely affected during the US-Peru free trade agreement specifically. It was signed by George W. Bush and Alan Garcia.
Yo amo la selva, yo amo la Amazonía, porque yo he vivido, yo he crecido. Yo soy de ahí.
Para crecer, el Perú necesita ampliar sus mercados. Lograr cada vez mayor inversión minera, petrolera, gasífera. Por eso los invito a invertir en el Perú. Si yo fuera miembro de la American Chamber, invertiría en el Perú. Ciertamente.
La tierra no se vende, la tierra no se negocia.
Había camiones detenidos a lo largo de toda la Amazonía.
Hemos enviado el orden y la tranquilidad pública.
Pero también 38 policías era insuficiente, pues si afuera tienes a 1.500 personas, era insuficiente.
Nosotros estamos de acuerdo con su protesta. Lamentablemente no lo podemos apoyar.
¡Señores policías! ¡Señores policías! ¡La lucha no es contigo! ¡La lucha no es contigo! ¡La ¡La lucha de este gobierno! ¡La lucha de este gobierno!
Estamos en este momento en una situación donde el gobierno ha tenido mucha serenidad y ya está bueno.
Ya ha habido descontrol total.
Y tenía que actuar además para poner finalmente orden y disciplina en este país.
Un gobierno democrático esté haciéndonos matar entre peruanos.
11 policías asesinados.
Indudablemente sucede porque ha existido aquí todo un plan, una instigación y un complot.
Yo quiero decir en este momento que ya estoy con orden de detención.
No les pido orden.
Es un tema cerrado acá, pero no está cerrado en la Amazonía.
Los policías son héroes porque pelearon con enemigos. ¿Y nosotros qué somos?
And this is a situation that's, as I mentioned, an isolated incident. We see this going on in many countries of the global south, including countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia. So if I may, here is the situation going on with the national protest movement in Colombia, where people are advocating against a tax reform that would really adversely affect indigenous communities as well as agricultural workers in Colombia.
Esto es un homenaje para Santiago y para Luca, para todos los que han muerto por querer vida justa. Exigieron su derecho y de respuesta una bala en el pecho. ¿Acaso ya no están satisfechos de gritos de clemencia de la madre por los hechos? La causa y consecuencia de subirle a los impuestos. Hay que no estar acuerdo para no escuchar al pueblo. Somos la nueva revolución, así que atentos. A parar para avanzar, un pueblo berraco no va a descansar. A parar para avanzar, viva el paro nacional. Ya no duermo, ya no como, de ver a mis hermanos estando solos, luchando y muriendo, y esto es para todos. Cambiemos nuestro mundo, que somos uno solo. Ya no duermo, ya no como, de ver a mis hermanos estando solos, luchando y muriendo, y esto es para todos. Cambiemos nuestro mundo, que somos uno solo. Parar para avanzar, un pueblo berraco no va a descansar. A parar para avanzar, viva el paro nacional. Quieren subirle al IVA, nosotros bajar a Duque. Nunca han querido que todo el pueblo se eduque. Reforma tributaria, ahora las tribus se unen. Luchamos por los que no pueden, no se preocupen. Pa'lante, pa'lante. Nos están matando pero seguimos adelante. Pa'lante, pa'lante. En memoria de los que se fueron, la lucha sigue constante. Pa'lante, pa'lante. Nos están matando pero seguimos adelante. Pa'lante, pa'lante. En memoria de los que se fueron, la lucha sigue constante.
Si ustedes los jóvenes no asumen la dirección de su propio país, nadie va a venir a salvárselo, nadie. Porque el problema de los colombianos somos que no tenemos una conciencia colectiva, tenemos una posición cómoda e individual ante la vida, cómoda. El problema soy yo, me salvo yo y el resto que...
The Warrior Brothers con el pueblo.
And lastly, I'd like to share kind of speech of Patrice Lumumba. We had discussed what happened in the Republic of the Congo, and kind of similarly how the situation is still a struggle within the Congolese people at risk of not being able to out of this situation of the resource curse, as what mineral resources, if not the infrastructure to protect addiction, and from addicted, bad results come with that. So this is kind of flying over the group and the correct color.
la liberté nationale. Vive l'indépendance et l'unité africaine. Vive les Congos indépendants et souverains.
Malcolm X called him the greatest black man who ever walked the African continent, while Belgium and the US plotted his assassination.
And just so we can get like context, this was a very powerful speech. And if we do have time, I'd like to go over
Le jour de l'indépendance,
more important.
le roi parle longuement des colons, de Léopold II. Il demande de penser à ces pionniers de l'émancipation africaine. Il demande surtout de ne rien changer, si on n'est pas sûr de faire mieux.
L'indépendance du Congo constitue l'aboutissement de l'œuvre conçue par le génie du roi Léopold II, entreprise par lui avec un courage tenace et continuée avec persévérance par la Belgique. Elle marque une heure décisive dans les destinées, non seulement du Congo lui-même, mais je n'hésite pas à l'affirmer, de l'Afrique tout entière.
Le roi a parlé. Il a dit ce qu'il avait à dire. Puis, le président dit ce qu'il devait dire et remercie le roi. De l'autre côté de la tribune, quelqu'un fignole un discours non prévu à l'école. Il va dire ce qu'il ne faut pas dire.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants, pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de notre lutte pour la liberté.
Le premier signe que quelque chose clochait, c'est au fond l'écoute que j'ai faite vers midi du discours prononcé par le Premier ministre Lumumba à Kinshasa, que j'ai écouté. Et alors là, je me suis dit, là, il y a quelque chose qui n'est pas tout à fait dans le sens que l'on espérait.
Les images ont été perdues. La voix est restée.
Nous avons connu les ironies, les insultes, les coups que nous devions subir au matin, midi et soir, parce que nous étions des nègres. Qui oubliera qu'à un noir, on disait tu, non certes comme à un ami, mais parce que les vous honorables étaient réservés aux seuls blancs.
Alors, je crois que je peux même affirmer que le roi était d'assez mauvaise humeur après le discours et qu'il a voulu quitter immédiatement et rentrer en Belgique et que, bon, c'est se rendant à la raison d'État qu'il est resté et qu'il a assisté au repas qui était prévu et où Lumumba d'ailleurs a fait un discours beaucoup plus aimable à l'égard de la Belgique, mais je crois que le mal était fait.
Nous y avons souffert dans notre corps, dans notre effet de l'oppression colonialiste. Nous vous le disons, tout cela est désormais fini.
Pour moi, c'est un super excité qui n'est pas capable de faire une échelle de valeur entre ce qui est important, ce qui est le moins et ce qui n'est pas du tout.
Juliana Lumumba, fille de Patrice Lumumba.
Le contexte de l'époque faisait que quand on était vraiment un nationaliste et qui aimait son pays et que les mots d'ordre, bon, que tous les politiciens disaient indépendance, liberté, liberté économique, indépendance économique et tout ça, c'est qu'il y croyait vraiment. Et les gens se sont rendus compte que ce n'était pas uniquement des slogans électoraux ou bien pour avoir des voix, mais que c'était un homme. À partir d'un certain moment, on ne pouvait pas composer avec lui sur l'indépendance de son pays et sur certains principes qu'il a érigés. Et je pense que c'est pour cela qu'on a vu toute cette coalition, parce qu'il n'y avait pas que la presse, il y avait aussi l'Église, qui a été aussi très pugnace et très dure vis-à-vis de Patrice Lumumba aussi. Et même pour d'autres politiciens qui avaient aussi lancé des mêmes mots d'ordre, qui avaient dit aussi les mêmes choses, mais ils n'ont pas été attaqués de la même façon.
On vous lâche au volant d'un bolide roulant à 200 km à l'heure, en sachant que vous n'avez jamais conduit de votre vie. On vous dit, allez-y, c'est votre tour. Dur apprentissage.
So now I'd like to open it up to conversation now that we're done with all the videos. So thank you for inundating me with a lot of like content and videos. So now we shall open it up to the discussion at large. What do we think when we currently see at the U.S. southern border the situation with Haitian migrants and other migrants that are fleeing from the same similar forms of structural adjustments that have been imposed upon the Haitian people or other peoples of the global South?
Again, I'll jump in, but I have a question too, right? So when I constantly see Haitian refugees, and it's not just this administration, it's a history of Haitian refugees constantly being returned, being pushed out, pushed away, returned back to incredibly horrible conditions. It makes me think about the Haitian Revolution, and we forget that Haiti, the only country to lead a successful rebellion against colonialism, and continues to be punished for that to this day. And so we cannot forget that history. Because I think folks oftentimes are, think about, they're lazy or this, and you need to do this, but we have to remember that this does go back to colonialism. Haiti did resist successfully. And again, one of the few places to do that, besides Ethiopia, and both of them still being punished to this day. But my question to you, sir, so you started out, and I love your phraseology, right? You started out from underdeveloped to overexploited. I love that because the underdeveloped talk focuses on the deficits and the lacking. The overexploited talk to me shifts not just the language, but how we understand it, right? That there's some responsibility, there's a reason why this lacking. There's some responsibility to be had, and it's not necessarily responsibility of these folks, right? So I love that. But can you talk and you kind of walk us through how some of these free trade agreements, whether we think they're good or bad, that when they get implemented on the home countries, not the US, the benefits usually go to the US, right? And it's people who suffer either directly as a result of a bad agreement or indirectly because money's been given to very corrupt leaders in government who then crack down on their people thanks to being able to buy more weapons. But I guess my question to you and to the rest of the audience, then what is equitable development at the end of the day, right? And so if it's not these free trade agreements, if it's not this foreign aid money, right, that comes with millions of strings that we never talk about, right? And so you get the publicity, oh, the US has sent $100 billion over here, but we don't get all the strings that come with it that allow the US influence over countries' economies and monetary policy. So what then is equitable development, and how do we get that? And that's not just to you, Ron. I want to open out to everybody. What does that mean, and how do we get there?
I just wanted to start by saying thank you for that question. I know that with the situation, specifically to Haiti as like the first independent, sovereign Black republic in this hemisphere, especially, there was a long-term amount of debts that they had to repay to the former colonizer, to France, to the République de France. And punishment is a real thing. If you defy the system will put you in check. We see that whether we're talking about countries in the Middle East, like Yemen. So there was a region of Yemen, not all of Yemen, but a region of Yemen that was trying to promote a different kind of government that was more, what we would consider to be more secular, to also be more progressive in terms of emancipation and improving the human conditions and things like this. But it quickly was, destroyed by enemy forces, and as well as it was also the people that were in that region were also punished till today. I mean, in really horrific conditions for attempting to defy the status quo. And we see that similarly, I think, in Haiti. But this was a very good question, one that I'm not sure if I can answer alone. So I would like to share with the entire audience here to see if we can come up with this dialogue with solutions about what equitable progress would look like in the global south. How do we get out of the resource curse? How do we get away from the adverse effects of free trade agreements and things of this nature? Is there an equilibrium that can be found?
I just came across a pithy quote addressing this, but I don't really know how it's going to be realized. The quote is, see if I can find it. Oh, this is actually from a Franciscan guy, but anyway, a corporation acts morally when it balances its rights to a just profit with its responsibilities for the common good, upon which it depends and profits. Most Western individualism refuses to recognize this common domain. I mean, that's addressing, the corporate state and corporate greed. Basically, it's saying, be fair and just. Big, giant money, lots of guns protected by the state corporation, but they don't look at it that way.
And I love that quote. Thanks, Dave. I love that quote because it also speaks to kind of where we're at today when we talk about what is the common good, that there are folks who won't wear masks to protect other folks from getting sick when we talk about the common good.
Mm-hmm. And there's something also to be added to that, because I do love that quote, David. Thank you for sharing. And there was a piece in there that you talked about where it says something about individualism, and something that I wanted to bring up in regards to the videos that we watched was this call for a collective community voice. And when we look at cultures in the global South, most are collective or more community, more rather than individualistic, which is the narrative that comes usually from the West. That's a Western narrative. And so when you're really thinking about individualism versus collectivism, you're coming into a whole, like there's a wall there, right? Because there's this idea of community, of collectivism, and yet the power is coming from an individualistic narrative, right? And so it really just goes completely against what culturally we're used to. And so it's hard to come up with a economic development that speaks to the community when you're not looking to get the community voice usually when you're making these types of decisions. And so I just see this as a big contrast when you're thinking about the cultures and individualistic versus collective, right? There's always going to be this big fight. We're not listening to the community voices necessarily. So that wasn't a solution. I'm just saying that that's an obvious issue and challenge.
I have another non-solution, and it's just something I heard from, it was a lecture by Howard Zinn when he was still alive. And he said that a friend of his who would maybe be critical of American free trade agreements and foreign policy. And people would say to him, thinking they were extremely patriotic, would say, well, if you don't like it here, why don't you go somewhere else? And I loved his response. I don't want to go somewhere else because I don't want to be a victim of American foreign policy. Ouch. But I thought, boy, that's painfully, frighteningly true. But again, I don't have a solution or answer.
Oh no, that response always bothers me, right? I remember as a college student attending predominantly white institutions, that would be a response you get all the time. If you don't like it here, then take yourself back to the South Side or go to an HBCU, because it's ahistorical. Go back to an African country because it's ahistorical, because folks forget we were here first.
So going back to thinking about solutions, is a solution then to stop imposing our culture and on other folks, and really thinking about how do we engage those that we're trying to kind of come in and benefit from. And I choose those words kind of intentionally, because where is the benefit as we've trying to unpack this for those who we're going in and trying to make these agreements with? What is the benefit? And so we're not going to get to that unless we have those conversations on a community level. So is that the solution? Can we do that? Can we go in and be more diplomatic in the way that we initiate these projects and initiatives, these trade agreements and so forth?
I would say that would be ideal, but unfortunately what I see is sometimes when it comes to the aggressiveness of the incentives that cause people to become more and more competitive, more and more aggressive, we go to that like race to the bottom situation where either you go with the free trade agreement and you do whatever it said, or you become victims of extreme isolation, blockade, sanctions, and there's a whole toolbox of things that will coerce your country to really abide by a certain way, go by a certain playbook. And so I think this is the situation at hand where, and most people I really like what Chad had mentioned with regards to how aid is not always aid. I think this is very important to understand. Sometimes when a lot of people think we're just giving so much aid to these countries. I don't know why they're messing things up with all the aid that we give them, you know? And it's like, I wish the aid was like, you know, rice or something good, but sometimes this aid comes in the form of tanks, you know, like things that are used to brutally repress populations that are asking for, you know, a gasp of freedom, and there's like a gasp of like human dignity. So I think this is the situation at hand in many cases. And that's why I think it's unsustainable, the current course that has been, you know, implemented for the last, since before I was born, perhaps before any of us were born. So
yeah. I think a lot of the foreign aid is really just a bribe to say, do your country a way that will make the most money. I mean, that's basically what a lot of it is, you know. But the terminology is, well, you know, we're concerned about your treatment, like in Afghanistan right now. It's like, we're concerned about your treatment of women, and we are sending a lot of aid, you know. We want to see how you guys are going to do it. But it's kind of lying and deceptive.
Yes, because if they don't do it the way we wanted to do it, the aid will disappear. Absolutely.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So really, it's just another form of bullying. It's you know, economic bullying
or bribery. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. For me, as someone who's training to be a historian, for me, history really does matter. So like, when we look at what's going on in Afghanistan right now, it's very difficult to look at it from like, oh, what's going on at this exact moment, and just completely forget about what's been going on for the last 40 years, 40, 50 years. So like the war that occurred in 1979, that's where I think a lot of the roots happened, and they happened to the point where it's irreversible, almost, or very difficult to reverse. And a lot of that initiated because of the U.S. involvement in 1979, which really toppled, like, or really like eradicated all the progressive, you know, forces within Afghanistan. Like they were eradicated, killed, destroyed. And so now all you had was more, you know, reactionary, conservative thinking that kind of took hold in Afghanistan. A lot of it, which was funded and backed by countries that we view as allies, or, you know, yeah, not a good situation, in my opinion.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, as a person that gets annoyed with the lack of history, especially in the media, so much is, hey, this happened, holy mackerel. And I always go, were you here 5 years ago? Forget about 40. Like, what the hell? So I'm happy to hear you say looking at it in the context of history is so important, you
know. Chris just dropped a comment in the chat that some folks like myself highlighting. I don't want to paraphrase or read for you, Chris. So if you're willing and able to unmute yourself, you want to share that?
So I'm doing two things at the same time, listening to all of this and still working. But for me, like I was saying, that there just doesn't seem to be, community is not thought about when these trade agreements are executed. It's the people at the top just talking to each other and trying to say, oh, we'll do this and we'll do that. And the people are not really considered. And so when they make these trade agreements, they say, oh, it's for the good of the people. What people? You haven't spoken to your people. You haven't had a conversation with your people. You haven't seen the needs and recognize that there is a true need in your communities when you execute these wonderful trade agreements that you know, go on public television and say, oh, we did a great, you know, trade agreement. For whom? For yourself, or for your people, or for your country? And so your people, you know, instead of your people seeing the so much wonderful aid that you said you executed for your people, you take that money and you buy more guns and you kill your people, you know, and you don't give your people food, and you don't give your people the things that they need to succeed. You don't give your people education so that they can succeed and become part of the community that you say that you're, you know, supported. So I'm you know, so people still suffer, people still are in poverty, the people still have food insecurities, the people have no health, no wellness. You know, all of that stuff is inefficient and continues to be inefficient. So nothing has changed. All we're doing is exchanging money at the top of, you know, of this thing. And we're not doing anything for the people who are at the bottom looking up and saying, can you help me, please? You know, so when I look at this and I see, you know, you talk about the sustainability in in the communities, in third world, or whatever you want to call it. Why are we called third world countries? It's because we're not given those, you know, we're not given the things that we need in order to survive. We're not given the, you know, the resources we need to pull ourselves out of those situations and become successful. Like everybody wants to call successful. What's successful? These people just want some food to eat. These people just want some education. These people just want their families to succeed and to just flourish. And we're at the top here going, oh, wonderful, you know, trade agreement. But for whom? That's the question.
Excellent. Yeah.
I see Laura who talks about what I like to call the nonprofit industrial complex. I don't know if you wanted to unmute yourself and share that.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't have my video, but first of all, I am outside the Lehigh community, so thank you for opening this up and allowing me to join. I'll just share that I started receiving these notifications because the company I work for this year, we decided to be extremely deliberate in our contributions to the university in targeting contributions to support students of color as part of our diversity initiatives. And so I started just learning about the university and what you guys were doing in that space, so we could better partner. And I started, you know, getting these notifications. So I've been listening to so many of these webinars, and so thank you very much for opening it up. But on this larger topic, you know, I am from one of the so-called third world underdeveloped countries, regions. I was born and raised in Dominica in the Caribbean, and the NGO model is such a terrible one, particularly when I think through environmental issues, and you take Africa, the whole continent of Africa, for example, and we think about pushing through like drinking water, right? So how long have we been talking about safe drinking water in Africa? And all of these NGOs and foundations have been pushing millions and millions, hundreds of millions of water to drinking water. But if we take from a historical perspective, how much of many of those countries, if we look at Nigeria, we look at Kenya, we look at some of those countries, populations haven't really grown to support sort of like why we haven't figured this out. right? And we continue trying to figure out clean water. And I think the model, this industrial complex of plastic bottles and clean water, and so even within the Caribbean region, most recently with the volcano eruption in St. Vincent, and the way NGOs are operating in so-called supporting the recovery, and I, so as you can tell, I'm really passionate about this. As somebody who, was born and raised in the region, I call myself a daughter of the Caribbean, and wanting to support the way that we talk about engaging the quote unquote diaspora. These nonprofits are not interested, these NGOs are not interested in really hearing from people like me, who want to say, this is how you should really go about it. And why? Is because I grew up there. I know how our people think. I know what, how we can communicate. Let us better communicate and ask people and get away from the savior complex, right? And so that's what I meant by disrupting this NGO model, is getting to the point where NGOs, with the critical missions that they have, it must be from a perspective of the people that they're trying to help, as opposed to the vision and mission of the NGOs. So are you there to truly help, or are you there to really do what you think you want to do and meet your own quote unquote goals, right? So anyway, I am off the soapbox. Thank you.
Oh, Laurel, thank you so much. That really, really spoke to so many of us that really, truly have heard, feel the same sentiments as you, and I appreciate you sharing your passion and being in this space with us today. And I think this really speaks to the title of this particular discussion, that this is truly the fight of the people, la lucha del pueblo, right? However, whatever language we want to use for that. And so we need to continue having these types of conversation, elevating the voices of our community, elevating the voices of those who live the day-to-day, and really critically thinking about the history and how it has affected us and continues to affect us.
Yeah.
I know we
Can
are-
I just add before you finish real quick that this type of conversation is also critical to organizations like mine and people like me who work in industry, in how we better partner with universities in changing pipeline, in meeting students where they are, how we recruit, and how we truly diversify, because that is also a space that we've been talking about. This one 2020, right? Diversity didn't just, birth because of what happened last year and COVID, but those types of conversations and thinking about it from that perspective, where we have to meet people where they are, and see them for who they are, instead of from really our perspective and our perch, is super, super valuable. So I took a lot from this today from a number of perspectives. So thank you again.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. It's collaboration, not competition, right? We are here to be able to be in community and collaborate with each other. I know we're coming up with time, and I want to just say thank you so much, Ronald, for bringing this topic to the M Room. We could talk about this for hours, and I really appreciate the way in which you brought this to this space. Want to also encourage everyone to come back and join us next week. Another very important conversation on the cost of living in America, and the housing crisis. So please join us for that conversation as well. And once again, thank you all for being in community with us and joining us today. Ronald, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ronald.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.